Imagine a map that never stops changing. Borders drawn in one season, erased in the next. Kingdoms rising and collapsing within a single lifetime. Cities that belonged to one ruler in your grandfather's time, another in your father's, and a third, or no one at all, just ash, by the time you came of age. Armies moving across the landscape like weather, not as dramatic, sudden storms, but as the permanent condition of the sky. Always there, always threatening, always arriving from some direction you hadn't quite expected. This was China for over 250 years. The period that historians call the Warring States, roughly 475 BCE to 221 BCE, was not a war in the way we typically use that word. A war has a beginning. It has an end. It has stakes that, once settled, allow life to resume some kind of normal shape. This was not that. This was a condition. A permanent state of siege in which peace was the exception, brief and distrusted, while conflict was the grammar in which everything else was written. 7 major states competed for dominance across what is now eastern China. Qi in the northeast, Chu in the south, enormous and proud of its cultural distinctiveness. Wei in the center, powerful and aggressive for a time before it burned too brightly and faded. Zhao in the north, Han, smaller than the rest and perpetually squeezed. Yan, cold and distant in the northeast, the last to fall and the most dramatically so. And Qin in the west, sitting behind natural barriers of mountains and river, poorer in culture and richer in discipline. They were not simply political rivals. They were, in many ways, different civilizations that had grown apart from a common ancestor. The Zhou dynasty, which had once held nominal authority over all of them, and whose collapse had set this entire period in motion. The Zhou kings still existed, still performed their rituals, still issued proclamations that carried the fading weight of a legitimacy. Everyone understood was no longer real. They were a symbol of an order that had ended. The actual business of power had moved elsewhere. And so the states fought. They formed alliances that dissolved before the ink dried. They hired philosophers and strategists to argue about the proper basis of governance, while simultaneously hiring generals to make the question moot. They sent spies. They sent assassins. They sent marriage proposals to bind royal families together in arrangements that lasted exactly as long as the strategic interests they were meant to serve. Farmers in this world did not get to be only farmers. They were conscripts waiting for the next call. Every man capable of carrying a weapon was a potential soldier, and states did not ask politely. Fields were abandoned in the middle of growing seasons. Harvests rotted unharvested. Women raised children and worked land and waited for the worst news or the second worst news, that the man was dead or that the man was coming home, broken in some way that would require the family to carry him for the rest of their years. Merchants navigated a world of moving borders and hostile tariffs, where a trade route that functioned perfectly in one year might pass through 3 different jurisdictions the next, each demanding its own fee, its own documentation, its own particular form of tribute to officials who might themselves be gone by the following season. Scholars wandered. The 100 schools of thought, that remarkable explosion of philosophical energy that produced Confucius, Laozi, Mozi, Mencius, and dozens of thinkers whose names history has half forgotten. These schools emerged precisely because there were enough competing courts to sustain competing ideas. A philosopher unwelcome in one state could find a patron in another. The instability that destroyed everything else created, as a strange byproduct, a culture of intellectual diversity unprecedented in the ancient world. But beneath the philosophy, the suffering was constant and compound. Generation after generation, the same story, repeated with different names in different locations. Violence as inheritance, insecurity as the permanent condition of being alive. And then, not suddenly, but in a direction that became clear only in retrospect, one state began to move differently. It was not the most sophisticated state, not the most culturally admired. The Eastern kingdoms looked at Qin and saw something rough, something frontier, something that had absorbed too many nomadic influences from the steppes and not enough of the refined traditions of the Central Plains. Qin was considered provincial in the way that powerful, established civilizations always condescend toward the forces that will eventually destroy them. Qin had been reforming itself for over a century. Under a minister named Shang Yang, it had restructured in ways that the other states regarded as extreme, and kept regarding as extreme right up until those extremes started winning battles. Meritocracy in the military, strict legal codes, collective responsibility, agricultural incentives. A system designed not around tradition or nobility or philosophical ideal, but around one ruthlessly practical question: what produces effective results? The answer, it turned out, was discipline, enforced consistency, a state that ran on rules rather than relationships. It was not comfortable. It was not beloved by those who lived under it. But it was functional in a way that mattered enormously on a battlefield. By the time a child was born into the Qin royal line in 259 BCS, the state had been building this engine for 3 generations. The engine was ready. What it needed was a driver. He would grow up to be that driver. He would grow up in the middle of the longest war anyone had ever known, shaped by its logic, marked by its demands, and eventually, with a combination of inherited advantage and personal ferocity and strategic brilliance that no single explanation fully captures, he would end it. Not by making peace, by making alternatives impossible. If this is the kind of history you want more of, history that takes ideas seriously, that goes beneath the surface of events, consider subscribing before we go further. There's a lot more to cover. His name was Qin Shi Huang. If you enjoy deep, thoughtful history documentaries, consider subscribing. He was not born into security. His father, a prince of Qin named Zichu, was not important enough to be kept at home. In the logic of the warring states period, royal hostages were a standard diplomatic instrument, a way of bonding agreements between states with something more personal than a treaty. Zichu had been sent to the state of Zhao as a hostage guarantee of Qin's good behavior, and there he remained in the capital city of Handan, watched and tolerated and not quite trusted, surviving on the limited generosity of a court that had no particular reason to like him. The boy was born into this condition. Not exile exactly, something subtler and more corrosive than exile. He was the son of a man who existed at the sufferance of people who could, if political conditions changed, decide his father was more useful dead than alive. He grew up in a foreign city, speaking its language, absorbing its rhythms, learning to navigate a world where his family's survival was not in his father's hands or in his own. It was in the hands of forces external and impersonal and entirely indifferent to their individual fates. What does that do to a child? It is easy to speculate, and dangerous to speculate too confidently. We do not have access to his interior life. The historical record of his early years is fragmentary and filtered through sources written long after the fact by people who had reasons to present him in particular ways. We cannot know what he felt, but we can observe what the environment demanded, and we can see how those demands shaped the behavior of the adult he became. To survive in Handan as the son of a low-ranking Qin hostage prince, you would need to develop a particular set of capacities. You would need to read rooms. You would need to understand which relationships offered genuine safety and which offered the performance of safety, which was more dangerous. You would need to distinguish between what people said and what they meant, between the courtesy of diplomacy and the coldness underneath it. You would need to become fluent in the language of power before you held any of it. He appears to have learned all of this. Meanwhile, the world around him continued to be shaped by the warring states' logic. Armies moved, borders shifted. Chen and Zhao fought. At one point, the situation became dangerous enough that the boy and his mother had to hide, their identities concealed to protect them from retribution against Chen. He lived for a time under a false name in a hostile city where being recognized could mean death. This is not an abstraction. He experienced this as a child. The experience of being vulnerable, genuinely, physically vulnerable, in a world that operated by force rather than sentiment. His father's situation changed when a wealthy merchant named Lu Buwei arrived in Handan. Lu Buwei was one of the most interesting figures of the entire period, a man of enormous commercial intelligence who understood that political investment could yield higher returns than commercial investment if you were willing to play the long game. He assessed Zichu as an undervalued asset, a low-ranking prince who, with the right backing and the right maneuvering, might be positioned for power in Qin. Lu Buwei invested. He became Zichu's patron, his advocate, his fixer. He spent lavishly to improve the prince's circumstances and his reputation at the Qin court. He persuaded the crown prince of Qin to designate Zichu as heir. Through a sequence of careful maneuvers, he turned a hostage prince nobody cared about into the designated future king of the most militaristic state in China. When Zichu eventually returned to Qin and ascended the throne, Lu Buwei became his chancellor. And when Zichu died, after only 3 years as king, the boy ascended to the throne of Qin in 247 BCE. He was 13 years old. 13, and inheriting a state that had been an engine of war for a century, inheriting advisors who had their own agendas, their own histories, their own relationships with power that predated him and would, they assumed, outlast him. Inheriting a military that was formidable, and a legal system that was functional, and a set of strategic advantages that were real, but also inheriting the assumption of everyone around him that a 13-year-old king was a king in name only, a symbol through whom the actual business of governance would be conducted by adults who knew better. Lu Buwei served as regent. His mother had her own entanglements, her own political relationships that complicated the court. The young king watched. He learned. He absorbed. And the warring states continued outside the palace. Qin's army still fought. The neighboring kingdoms still schemed. The logic that had governed everything for 2.5 centuries continued operating as if nothing had changed. What the boy growing into kingship understood. What the environment he had grown up in had forced him to understand, was that this logic had an answer. The chaos was not permanent in the way that everyone assumed it was permanent. It was permanent only as long as no single force was strong enough to end it completely. The moment one state became strong enough to eliminate all the others, the warring states period ended. Not managed, not balanced, ended. It is a simple insight, stated plainly. but the simplicity disguises its radicalism. No ruler before him had actually pursued it as a concrete project. They had pursued dominance, influence, advantage. They had sought to be the strongest among equals. He decided to eliminate the equals. By the time he reached his mid-20s, he had removed Lu Buwei from power, carefully using the merchant's own overreach and political vulnerabilities against him. He had consolidated his personal authority over the court. He had begun surrounding himself with advisors who understood strategy in the particular mode he had come to favor. Not what is honorable, not what is traditional, but what works. The Warring States period had given him his education. Now he was about to give it its conclusion. The conquest of 6 kingdoms sounds, when described briefly, like a military achievement. Something that belongs in the category of great battles, famous generals, legendary campaigns. It was not primarily that. The unification of China under Qin was, above all, a management problem. A problem of resources and timing and intelligence and the systematic removal of obstacles. The battles were real. Soldiers died in enormous numbers, cities fell, populations were displaced. But the battles were downstream of decisions made in chancelleries and private meetings and encrypted correspondence. Qin did not win by fighting better. It won by making the fight, in a sense, happen before the actual fighting. The key figure in this process, alongside the emperor himself, was Li Si. Li Si was a man of remarkable abilities and remarkable moral flexibility. A student of the philosopher Xunzi, who had trained under a Confucian framework before concluding that legalism offered better tools for the world as it actually was. He came to Qin as a young man of no particular status, and rose through the administration entirely on the strength of his intelligence and his willingness to think about power without sentimentality. His central insight, which shaped the entire strategy of conquest, was this: the goal is not to defeat an enemy. The goal is to make the enemy incapable of organized resistance before you ever engage them. Defeat a capable enemy, and you've won one battle. Dismantle an enemy's capacity for coherent decision-making, and you've already won the war. So Qin spent money, enormous amounts of money, directed not at weapons but at corruption. Officials in the courts of Han, Zhao, Wei, Chu, Yan, and Qi were identified, assessed, and approached. Those who could be bribed were bribed, given gold, given silk, given promises of continued position under a new administration. Those who refused bribes were watched for vulnerabilities that could be exploited differently. Their personal relationships, their factional enemies within their own courts, their private fears, all of this was mapped and filed and used. When a general in a rival state began to demonstrate the kind of military competence that might slow Qin's advance, the apparatus focused on him. Not necessarily to kill him. That could backfire, create martyrs, galvanize resistance. Better to discredit him in the eyes of his own king. A carefully placed rumor that he was negotiating with Qin. Evidence, real or manufactured, of disloyalty. A whisper campaign in the right ears at the right moment. This happened most famously in Zhao. The Zhao General Li Mu was arguably the most capable military commander of the period, a man who had successfully defended against both Qin's armies and the Xiongnu nomads from the north. Qin could not easily defeat him in the field. So Qin's agents worked to poison his relationship with the Zhao king, spreading suggestions of treason until the king ordered Li Mu's arrest. Li Mu refused to comply with the order, which confirmed in the king's mind the rumors of his disloyalty. He was executed by his own side. Zhao fell to Qin shortly afterward. This is not war as heroism. This is war as administration, carried out by people who understood that the goal is not the glory of combat, but the fact of victory. The military campaigns that followed this preparatory work were still bloody. Hundreds of thousands of people died. Cities were besieged and taken. Populations were massacred or enslaved or forcibly relocated. The Qin army was not gentle. Its meritocratic reward system, in which soldiers were compensated for the number of enemy heads they collected, created an incentive structure that was effective and horrifying in equal measure. But the sequence of conquest was carefully ordered. Han in 230 BCE, the smallest, the weakest, the most strategically positioned to be taken first for the supply line advantage it offered. Zhao in 228 BCE, weakened by the removal of Li Mu and by the damage it had already sustained in decades of conflict. Wei in 225 BCE. The Qin general Wang Ben diverted the Yellow River to flood the Wei capital, a tactical decision that reduced resistance and demonstrated that Qin was willing to destroy a city rather than simply capture it. Chu was the hardest. It was the largest remaining state, with deep cultural pride and a population that had reason to fight. An initial Qin campaign against Chu failed. The general in charge, Li Xin, underestimated the resistance and was defeated. The emperor had to reorganize, recall the older general Wang Jian from retirement, give him everything he needed, and commit to a longer and more expensive campaign. Wang Jian took Chu in 223 BCE by the unglamorous method of patience, encamping his army near Chu's forces for months, keeping them fed and drilled and rested, allowing Chu's logistical situation to deteriorate, and attacking only when the conditions were decisively favorable. Yan and Qi fell in 222 and 221 BCE, respectively. Qi barely resisted at all. Its king had been persuaded by Qin agents that peace was possible, that negotiation would protect him. It would not. Qin took Qi without significant military opposition, which is perhaps the cleanest demonstration of the entire strategy. An enemy that doesn't fight is easier to take than one that does, and an enemy that doesn't fight is one whose court has been sufficiently managed. By 221 BCE, it was done. The surviving records suggest a moment of genuine reflection at the Qin court about what had just been accomplished. The king of Qin called his ministers together to decide something that sounds procedural but was actually of enormous symbolic weight. What should he be called? The title of king was insufficient. Every state that had just been absorbed had kings. He was something new, something without a precedent. He chose Huangdi, emperor, combining characters associated with the legendary sage kings of antiquity and the supreme deity of the ancient Chinese cosmology. He was the first emperor, Shi Huangdi, and in that title was embedded a statement. This is not a continuation of what came before. This is the beginning of something else. He intended for there to be a second emperor after him, a third, a 10th, a 1000th. He imagined a dynasty that would run not for generations but for ages. It would run for 15 years after his death. But that is a later part of the story. The immediate problem was simpler and harder. He had ended the war. Now he had to build something in its place, not just an administration, a world, a unified world where unity had never existed before, imposed on people who had lived their entire lives inside different systems, different expectations, different senses of what authority meant and where it came from. Winning, he understood, was the beginning of the problem, not the end. He stood at the center of something that had never existed, and he had to decide what it was. Military conquest creates a territory. It does not create a civilization. The land was his. The armies were defeated. The former kings were deposed, some killed, some relocated to the capital where they could be watched, their lands absorbed into the imperial administrative structure. The physical fact of unity existed, but physical facts are not enough. Consider what the people living across this newly unified territory actually experienced. A farmer in the former state of Qi had grown up under Qi's legal code, paid taxes according to Qi's system, used Qi's currency to trade at market, and measured his grain in Qi's standard. His world was legible to him, its rules known, its institutions familiar, its rhythms internalized over a lifetime. The fact that a distant king now controlled everything meant very little in practical terms until it started to mean something in daily life, and it needed to mean something. That was the point. If unity existed only on the map and not in the texture of actual life, it was a fiction. And fictions, in a world that had just emerged from 2.5 centuries of war, were not durable. So the emperor and Li Si undertook a project of standardization so comprehensive that it had no real parallel in the ancient world. It was not, at root, an administrative convenience. It was a theory of power made practical. The understanding that control of the material conditions of daily life is a more durable foundation for authority than military presence alone. Currency came first, in a sense, because it was most immediately legible to everyone. The empire had been running on at least 6 different currency systems, each with different values, different weights, different standards. Trade across what had been borders was a negotiation before it was a transaction. You had to agree on exchange rates before you could agree on prices. This was inefficient, but more than inefficient. It was a daily reminder that the world was made of distinct, non-interchangeable parts. The Qin bronze coin, the ban liang, meaning half ounce, became the single currency of the empire. Round with a square hole in the center, a shape that carried cosmological resonance, the round heaven, the square earth. Every transaction in the empire now used the same medium. The market at the edge of the former Qi territory operated on the same terms as the market at the edge of former Chu. For merchants who had spent their careers navigating currency exchanges, this was transformative. For the state, it was control, because the power to issue currency is the power to define value itself. Weights and measures were more technical, but equally significant. The empire issued standardized measuring vessels, bronze containers of specific capacity, distributed to administrative centers, against which all local measuring tools had to be calibrated. A she of grain in the east was identical to a she of grain in the west. Contracts written in one part of the empire were legible in another. Courts could adjudicate disputes across regions because the underlying quantities were shared. This sounds mundane, but the political implications were profound. Standardization of weights and measures means that the center can verify what the periphery is doing. Tax collection becomes auditable. Fraud becomes harder to hide. The administrative apparatus of the empire can actually function coherently across vast distances because it is operating on a shared basis of measurement. The written script was, perhaps, the most consequential standardization of all. Spoken language across the former kingdoms was already deeply divergent, dialects that were, in some cases, mutually incomprehensible. That divergence was not addressable in the short term. Spoken language cannot be standardized by decree, but written language could be. The various states had developed their own written scripts, all descended from common ancestors, but diverged enough that a document written in one style could not easily be read by someone trained in another. Li Si oversaw the creation of a unified script, a standardized system of characters that would serve as the official written language of the empire. Officials trained in this script could read documents from anywhere. Laws issued from Xianyang could be understood at the empire's most distant administrative posts. The emperor's words could travel in written form and arrive, unchanged and legible, at any point in the territory. Literacy in the unified script became a requirement for official service, which meant that official service became the mechanism by which the unified script spread. Every official trained in the system was a node in the network. Every document produced in that script was a reinforcement of the shared framework. Then, infrastructure. The road network, the system of imperial highways that the emperor ordered, built across the empire, was not primarily about commerce. It was about speed of response. A message from the capital could reach distant provinces in days rather than weeks. An army could be moved to address a rebellion faster than the rebellion could organize and consolidate. The empire's nervous system, the network along which information and force could travel, was being built to serve centralized authority. And then there is the detail about axle widths. The emperor standardized the width of vehicle axles across the empire. This meant that roads built for standard-width vehicles would develop ruts in predictable locations, and vehicles of the standard width would move easily in those ruts, while non-standard vehicles would not. The infrastructure itself became a mechanism of compliance, not through explicit enforcement, but through the simple physics of easier travel for those who conformed. This is important to sit with. It represents a theory of control that goes beyond law. Law says, do this or face punishment. Architecture says, this is easier than that. The emperor was building a world in which conformity was the path of least resistance, not because deviation was explicitly forbidden, though it often was, but because the physical environment was structured to reward standardization. The administrative system completed the picture. The feudal model, in which lords held a territory in exchange for loyalty, maintaining their own armies, their own courts, their own traditions, was abolished. In its place, commanderies and counties, administered by officials directly appointed by the central government, who held their positions only as long as the emperor chose, who could be promoted or transferred or removed at any moment. Former nobles from the defeated kingdoms were relocated to the capital region, tens of thousands of them, uprooted from the power bases and local relationships that would have allowed them to organize resistance. In Xianyang, they could be watched. They could be given roles in the imperial court that made them dependent on the emperor's favor rather than on local loyalty. Power was not distributed. It was concentrated. Every node in the system pointed back to the center. Every official's authority derived from the center. Every standard of currency, of measure, of script, of administration was the center's standard, imposed outward. What he built was not, in the end, primarily an empire in the territorial sense. It was a machine for the generation and maintenance of centralized authority. A machine so comprehensive in its reach that it would serve as the template for Chinese governance not just for the next dynasty, but for the next 2,000 years. The question of whether this was good whether the people who lived under it were better off than the people who had lived under the fragmented chaos before, is genuinely complicated. The war was over. Trade was easier. The legal system, harsh as it was at least consistent in a way that the patchwork of warring state laws had not been. But the cost was also real. Authority that reached further than any authority had reached before also demanded compliance further than anyone had been demanded to comply. Uniformity is a powerful thing. It enables scale. It enables coordination. It enables the construction of things that no fragmented system could build. It also flattens. It removes the space in which difference lives. He was not interested in the space in which difference lived. He was interested in the space in which his authority operated without friction. In 213 BCE, at a banquet in the imperial court, something happened that would define how history remembered Qin Shi Huang more than almost anything else he did. A scholar named Chunyu Yue stood up at the banquet and addressed the emperor directly. His argument was historical. The great rulers of antiquity, the legendary sage kings who were held up as models of proper governance, had enfeoffed their relatives and loyal ministers, giving them territories to govern. This was the Zhou model. This was tradition. And Qin, in abolishing feudalism and replacing it with directly appointed governors, had departed from tradition in a way that left the emperor without the network of loyal family members and allies who could protect the dynasty in times of crisis. The argument was not fringe. It was the standard Confucian position on governance, rooted in centuries of accumulated commentary, in the texts that every educated person had read, in the philosophical tradition that the scholars at court saw as the legitimate framework for evaluating how power should be exercised. Li Si's response was immediate and decisive. He argued not against the specific claim but against the premise. The problem, he said, was not that Qin had departed from the Zhou model. The problem was that scholars had access to historical models at all, that they could use the past as a standard against which to measure the present and find the present wanting. The solution he proposed was radical. Remove the reference materials. The edict that followed ordered the burning of most privately held books. The histories of the former kingdoms, which preserved the memory and legitimacy of the states Qin had absorbed. The works of the philosophical schools, Confucianism, Mohism, the School of Names, the various intellectual traditions that had flourished during the Hundred Schools period. Poetry, literature, texts that shaped how people understood themselves and their world. Exempted, practical, manuals, medical texts, agricultural guides, books on divination which the emperor used, the works of legalism, and any texts held in the imperial archive, because the state would keep the past for itself. This last point is crucial and easy to overlook. The burning of books was not the destruction of knowledge as such. It was the nationalization of knowledge. The state kept its copies. Scholars in imperial service could access the archive. What was being destroyed was the existence of alternative centers of textual authority. Private libraries, independent scholars, communities of readers who maintained their own relationship with the past. Why does this matter? Because texts are not inert. A text about the Zhou dynasty is not simply a historical document. It is an argument. It says, this is how things were done. It says, legitimate authority looked like this. In the hands of a scholar with an audience, that argument can become a political claim. It can say, the current regime departs from the model of legitimate authority. Therefore, the current regime's claim to legitimacy is questionable. Li Si understood this with unusual clarity. As long as people could read the histories of the former kingdoms, they could remember and romanticize what those kingdoms had been. As long as people could read Confucian texts about the Zhou model, they had a framework for judging the emperor and finding him deficient. Thought is not free-floating. It is built from materials. Control the materials, and you substantially constrain the thoughts that can be built from them. The burning of books was an act of epistemological control, an attempt to determine what kinds of thinking were possible by determining what intellectual resources were available. A year later, the suppression became more direct. Scholars, estimates range from several hundred to over 400, were executed, or, according to some accounts, buried alive. The details are disputed. Our sources are largely from the Han dynasty, which had strong reasons to present the Qin as barbaric. But the pattern is clear enough. The emperor was not tolerating the continued existence of an intellectual culture that positioned itself as a check on his authority. The Confucian scholars who were targeted were not simply academics. They were, within the social structure of the time, moral authorities, people whose role in the culture was to evaluate governance against ethical standards and to say, publicly and with the weight of tradition behind them, when those standards were not being met. Eliminating them was not an act of cultural Philistinism. It was the removal of a competing source of social authority. What was lost, more than anyone can now calculate. The Han dynasty, after Qin's collapse, launched an enormous effort to recover and reconstruct the destroyed texts. Finding elderly scholars who had memorized works before the burning, piecing together fragments, working from oral traditions that had preserved some of what the written records had contained. Many texts were partially recovered. Many were not. Some threads of the intellectual tradition simply ended. But there is something more subtle that was lost, and it is harder to name. The Warring States period, for all its violence, for all its chaos, had been a period of intellectual freedom that was, in certain ways, quite extraordinary. The competition between states meant that no single authority could suppress all dissent. A philosopher unwelcome in Qin could go to Chu. An idea too radical for one court might find welcome in another. The fragmentation that made the period so destructive also made it, paradoxically, hospitable to diversity of thought. That ended. Not immediately, intellectual life continued, adapted, found forms compatible with imperial authority. But the culture of open debate, of competing schools arguing in public about the proper nature of governance, and human nature and the cosmos, that culture was broken in a way it did not recover from under Qin. The irony is that suppressing ideas does not usually destroy them. It drives them underground. It gives them a kind of martyred energy that open expression never generates. The Confucianism that the emperor tried to eliminate became, under the Han dynasty, the official ideology of the state, precisely because the persecution had given it the status of a tradition worth defending. You cannot kill an idea by burning its books. You can delay it. You can make it harder to transmit. But the idea itself finds ways to survive. What you can do, and what he did, is change the terms on which ideas are produced and circulated. After Qin, scholars in China knew that certain kinds of thought carried certain kinds of risk. That knowledge never entirely went away. The relationship between intellectual culture and state authority in China was shaped in part by what happened in those years, by the demonstration that a sufficiently powerful state would not tolerate being judged by standards it did not control. Control requires limiting thought, not eliminating it, that is impossible, but containing it, directing it, removing the tools that make certain kinds of thinking possible. He understood this. He acted on it. And the consequences echoed for centuries. Power, if it is to last, must become physical. This is a lesson that rulers across history have understood at an instinctive level, even when they couldn't articulate it clearly. Ideas are fragile. Laws can be rewritten. Armies can be defeated. But a wall, a road, a city, these persist beyond the political arrangements that created them. They exist in the world, requiring resources and effort to destroy, serving functions that make them worth maintaining long after the original purpose has been complicated by time. Qin Shi Huang built with a comprehensiveness and a scale that was unlike anything the Chinese world had ever seen. And it is worth being precise about this, because the scale is easy to describe in numbers and hard to actually feel. Numbers require context to become real. The network of imperial roads, the straight roads and their branches, covered approximately 6,800 kilometers at their peak. To build this in a pre-industrial society, without machinery, using hand tools and human muscle and animal labor, required the conscription of an enormous workforce. Estimates run into the hundreds of thousands of workers at various points in the construction. These workers did not volunteer. They were assigned, pulled from their farms and families by an administrative system that treated their labor as a resource belonging to the state. The construction methods were not gentle. Workers who did not meet production targets faced punishment. Workers who became ill or injured were not a system priority. The mortality rate in these projects, particularly those in harsh environments or on tight timelines, was high enough to generate its own folklore of death, its own cultural memory of sacrifice extracted under compulsion. The Great Wall Project was, in human terms, probably the most costly. The wall that exists today, the impressive stone structure that tourists photograph, is almost entirely from the Ming Dynasty, built over 1,000 years after Qin. What Qin actually built was different. A connected series of earthen and rammed earth walls, linking and extending defenses that had existed in various forms under the former northern states. The emperor sent his general Meng Tian north with an army estimated at 300,000 soldiers, who also served as the construction workforce. The northern frontier was a different world from the administrative heartland. Cold in winter, arid in stretches, far from the supply networks that kept the Central Empire fed and equipped. Getting food and tools and building materials to construction sites at the edge of the steppe required supply chains of extraordinary length, managed with the same meticulous administrative attention that the empire brought to everything else, and still frequently failing, with workers going hungry in the field while the bureaucracy sorted out a logistical problem 300 kilometers to the south. The purposes of the wall were multiple. It was a physical barrier against the Xiongnu, the nomadic confederation that represented the most persistent external military threat Qin faced. It was a statement about where the empire ended. It was a symbol in the most direct sense, a visible object large enough to communicate, "This is where we are," to everyone on both sides of it. And it was an employment of the conscript labor system on a scale that justified and normalized the system itself. One of the things that large construction projects do, politically, is demonstrate that the state can do things that no individual or local community could do alone. They make the state's power legible in physical terms. When you look at a wall that stretches beyond the horizon in both directions, you are looking at something that required coordination at a scale only centralized authority can achieve. It is, in a sense, a monument to the idea of centralized authority. Not just a useful structure, but an argument. His palace complex at Xianyang was another argument. He ordered the construction of replicas of the palaces of all 6 conquered kingdoms, built along the Wei River north of the capital, each in the style of the state it represented, inhabited by the relocated consorts and musicians of the defeated rulers. It was an act of cultural absorption and also of display. All the former grandeur of the conquered states collected and arranged for the emperor's convenience. And then there was the tomb. Work on his burial complex began, according to some accounts, when he first took the throne at 13. Before the unification, before the conquests, before he became the first emperor, rather than simply the king of Qin. It continued throughout his reign, an estimated 700,000 workers at various periods, over 30 years of construction, a complex covering 56 square kilometers, larger than the Forbidden City. What has been excavated represents perhaps a fraction of the whole. The terracotta army is extraordinary and famous. Over 8,000 clay soldiers, each face individually modeled to be distinct, arranged in battle formation, accompanied by bronze chariots and terracotta horses and weapons of real bronze. They were not mass-produced figures. They were, in a sense, portraits, an army individualized at enormous scale, equipped as if for actual warfare, positioned as if to defend an actual territory. The territory they were defending was the afterlife version of the empire. Ancient texts describe the interior of the burial mound itself as a microcosm of the world. A domed ceiling inlaid with pearls representing the stars, floors mapped to show the geography of the empire, rivers of mercury representing the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, flowing through mechanical channels. Crossbow traps set to fire automatically at anyone who entered. The emperor's concubines, those who had not borne sons, who therefore had no claim on succession and no one to advocate for their survival, were buried with him. If you read this description as simple extravagance, the excess of a man with unlimited power, you miss what it reveals about his thinking. He built a replica of his empire underground because he was not willing to give it up. Even death was a problem to be managed, a condition to be administered. The afterlife version of the emperor would have an afterlife version of the army, an afterlife version of the territory, an afterlife version of the rivers and the stars. The control would continue, in some form, past the point where control is normally possible. This is not madness. This is the logical endpoint of a worldview that had been built around the idea that the emperor was indispensable, that the system existed because he willed it, and that the system required him to persist. If the empire could not function without him, then the solution was to make him, in some form, not stop. The tomb remains, mostly sealed. The decision not to excavate it immediately is itself meaningful, a recognition that the technology required to do it without damaging what's inside doesn't yet exist. Somewhere under Mount Li, the first emperor waits. His army waits. The mercury, if the ancient accounts are accurate, still moves. He wanted permanence. He built toward it with everything he had. The question is whether permanence can be built at all, or whether it is always, finally, the thing that the present promises to the future and the future refuses to deliver. There is a moment. Historians cannot date it precisely, cannot point to a single event and say, here, this is where it happened. When the emperor's orientation shifted. Before the shift, he was pointed outward, toward conquest, toward standardization, toward the construction of a unified world, toward the elimination of alternatives and the establishment of a system so comprehensive that chaos could not return. After the shift, he was pointed inward, toward himself, toward the question that all the power in the world cannot answer. How long? He was in his late 30s, perhaps his early 40s, when the obsession with immortality appears to have become central. He had done everything that could be done in political terms. The war was over. The system was built. The monuments were rising. He had, by any measure, accomplished something unprecedented. And the standard human response to having accomplished something unprecedented is to start worrying about losing it. He could not protect everything he had built from the one force that was beyond his administrative reach. The belief systems of the time offered frameworks for thinking about this. Taoist philosophy, in various forms, included traditions of thought about the extension of life, about the possibility of aligning oneself with the fundamental forces of nature in ways that could, theoretically, transcend the normal limits of human existence. Alchemists and physicians worked within these traditions, developing substances and practices that they claimed could purify the body, cultivate vital energy, and resist the deterioration that led to death. The emperor engaged these traditions with the same intensity he brought to everything else. He sent expeditions across the known world in search of the legendary islands of immortality, Penglai, Fangjiang, Yingzhou, places described in ancient texts as existing somewhere in the Eastern Sea, inhabited by beings who had transcended death and possessed the knowledge of how to do so. A man named Xu Hu was commissioned to lead the most famous of these expeditions, departing with a fleet of ships and a cargo of supplies, and, according to some accounts, thousands of young men and women chosen for their health and vitality as either workers or potential settlers on the island of immortals. Xu Hu never returned. The explanations range from the plausible to the legendary. He may have reached Japan. There are traditions in certain Japanese regions that connect local founding myths to a fleet of Chinese arrivals in the ancient past. He may have simply met the fate that awaits most people who sail into unknown waters with inadequate navigational knowledge. What is certain is that the expedition found no islands of immortality, returned no elixir, delivered no secret. Other expeditions followed. Other practitioners promised results. The emperor moved among his 365 palaces, a number so large that no one, himself included, could know which he occupied on any given night, which was the point, and he received reports from alchemists and physicians about their progress, and he waited. He consumed mercury. This requires a pause, because the word mercury sounds to modern ears like obvious poison, something no one could mistake for medicine. But in the cosmological framework of ancient China, mercury occupied a peculiar and significant position. It was neither solid nor liquid in the way other substances were. It shone like silver. It moved in ways that seemed to defy normal categorization. It was associated with particular properties in the proto-scientific and proto-philosophical traditions of the time. And it was indeed used in various preparations. Cinnabar, a mercury compound, appears repeatedly in ancient texts about longevity practices. The physicians and alchemists who prepared these substances for the emperor were not frauds in the simple sense. They worked within a theoretical framework that was coherent by the standards of their time and that had, in certain applications, genuine medicinal properties. They were wrong about mercury, but they were wrong in a way that required many decades of use and many victims to demonstrate, not in a way that was obvious to anyone at the time. Chronic mercury poisoning produces specific effects: neurological disruption, cognitive changes, mood instability, sudden anger, paranoia, emotional volatility, physical deterioration, the progressive impairment of the systems that regulate judgment and behavior. The accounts of the emperor's behavior in his later years align with this symptom profile in ways that are difficult to ignore. A man who had been capable of sustained, complex strategic thinking, who had orchestrated the conquest of 6 kingdoms and the construction of a unified administrative system, began to exhibit patterns of behavior that seem erratic by comparison. Explosive anger, deepening paranoia, an increasingly narrow circle of trust. Decisions made on the basis of information that became more and more filtered, as the emperor became less and less tolerant of unwelcome truths. He survived assassination attempts. 3 are well documented in the historical record. The most famous involved Jing Ke, a swordsman hired by the state of Yan in a desperate attempt to kill the Qin king before Qin could conquer Yan. Jing Ke gained access to the court under the pretense of delivering a diplomatic gift, a map concealing a poisoned dagger. He got close enough to grab the emperor's sleeve. The emperor drew his sword but struggled to unsheath it. It was ceremonially long, designed for display rather than quick use. He ran around his throne. Court officials, forbidden from carrying weapons in the royal presence, were unable to help. A physician struck Jing Ke with his medicine bag, buying enough time for the emperor to finally draw his sword and wound the assassin. Jing Ke was killed. But he had been very close. Afterward, the emperor's behavior changed. More guards, more secrecy about his movements, more anger directed at the state of Yan and its surviving leadership. The paranoia that was probably already building from the mercury became organized around a series of specific threats. By his late 40s, the emperor was conducting much of his business through written communication rather than direct audiences. He moved constantly. His location was classified information. Officials who revealed where he was faced execution. The man who had built a system premised on centralized authority was becoming inaccessible to that system, physically hidden from the people who were supposed to receive his direction and provide him with information. In 210 BCE, during an inspection tour of the Eastern Empire, he traveled constantly, in part from genuine interest in administering his territory, in part from a restlessness that his court found exhausting. He fell ill. The accounts are vague in the way that accounts of powerful people's health crises tend to be vague when those accounts were written by people who were present and scared. He died somewhere in the eastern provinces at the age of 49. 49. This is young. For comparison, the average reign of a Chinese emperor across the imperial period that he inaugurated lasted about 20 years. He had reigned for 37 years as king and emperor combined, accomplished more in that time than most rulers accomplish in a lifetime, and then died at an age when many of his successors were still in the middle of their reigns. The mercury had done its work. The man who had searched for immortality had been shortened by the search. One of the less examined aspects of his reign is the question of what he actually knew about the empire he governed. He had built a comprehensive administrative system. He had standardized the mechanisms by which information was supposed to travel from the periphery to the center. Reports from county magistrates to commandery governors to the imperial court. In theory, creating a clear channel through which the emperor could know the state of affairs across his territory. In theory. In practice, information systems in hierarchical organizations face a consistent problem. The consequences of delivering bad news shape the content of the news that gets delivered. An official who reports that tax collection in his district has failed because the harvest failed, and the people have nothing left, risks being seen as an incompetent administrator rather than as an honest reporter. An official who reports that conscription is generating dangerous levels of popular resentment risks being seen as disloyal rather than perceptive. The Qin legal system was not gentle with failure. Officials who did not meet their administrative targets faced real consequences: demotion, punishment, occasionally death. In an environment where the cost of being seen to fail is severe, the rational strategy for a local official is to present the best possible picture of local conditions, to smooth over problems, to report success and minimalize difficulty, and to hope that by the time the gap between the reported reality and the actual reality becomes undeniable, someone else is in charge. This is not specific to Qin. It is a feature of all sufficiently powerful hierarchies. But Qin made it worse in particular ways. The emperor's increasing paranoia and his demonstrated willingness to execute people who displeased him made the cost of delivering unwelcome information particularly high. The court had seen what happened to people who crossed him. They had absorbed the lesson, and so the reports that reached the emperor told him what the reporters needed to tell him. The empire, in the version of reality that arrived at Xianyang, was more stable, more prosperous, more loyal, and more functional than the empire that actually existed. The gap was widening. The conscription of hundreds of thousands of workers for the wall and the roads and the tomb complex was straining communities to breaking point, pulling men away from farms at times when agricultural labor was essential, forcing families to survive without their primary workers, creating debts and dislocations that cascaded through entire local economies. The tax burden required to fund the construction and the military and the administrative apparatus was heavy in the best conditions and crushing in bad ones. And conditions were not always good. In the provinces of the former kingdoms, resentment was accumulating. Not revolutionary resentment, not yet the organized, politically articulate opposition that historians describe. The simpler, more fundamental resentment of people who are tired, hungry, and overextended, who have been asked to give more than they have, and who have no mechanism by which that fact can reach the people making the demands. Because the mechanism was broken, the feedback loop that would have told the emperor that his empire was under strain was producing signals that said the empire was fine. Meanwhile, in the inner court, the dynamic was different but equally distorting. The men who had greatest access to the emperor, Li Si, Zhao Gao, the small circle of advisors and officials who could actually reach him, were men whose influence depended on remaining in the emperor's confidence. Their interests were aligned not with telling the truth, but with maintaining their positions, which required giving the emperor information he found acceptable and minimizing information he did not. Zhao Gao is the extreme case. He was a eunuch official of remarkable intelligence and complete moral flexibility, whose power in the inner court rested entirely on his ability to manage what the emperor perceived and believed. He controlled access. He shaped the information environment. He understood, with the clarity that comes from having no distractions of principle, that power in a court of absolute authority belongs to the person who controls what the authority knows. He shaped that knowledge. And the emperor, cut off by his own security apparatus from direct contact with the empire, isolated by his own paranoia from honest counsel, slowly became the inhabitant of a picture of reality that Zhao Gao and the people around him were painting. It is a trajectory that does not require malice to explain, though Zhao Gao was certainly not without malice. It requires only the logic of incentives playing out in a system where the cost of honesty is high and the reward for telling people what they want to hear is survival. The emperor was alone at the top. Not alone in the sense of having no company. He was surrounded constantly by officials and guards and servants and advisors. But alone in the sense that the world he inhabited, as his reign progressed, became increasingly his own creation rather than a reflection of any external reality. He made decisions about that world. He issued laws and orders and decrees that were shaped by his understanding of what was true. And his understanding was increasingly wrong. This is the vulnerability of absolute power, stated plainly. The more completely you control the flow of information, the less good information you receive. The more severe the consequences of disagreeing with you, the less often anyone will disagree. The safer you make yourself from challenge, the less often you are challenged, which is not the same as the less often you are wrong. He was wrong about the stability of the empire he had built. He was wrong about the loyalty of the people who inhabited it. He was wrong about how long what he had created could sustain itself. He had no way to know he was wrong. He had built a system that made knowing it impossible. The emperor died in the summer of 210 BCE. The body was in a carriage, returning toward the capital. The smell, in the summer heat, was managed with cartloads of salted fish ordered alongside the imperial procession, a detail so unglamorous and so human that it cuts through the mythology with unexpected force. The man who had built a replica empire for the afterlife was, at the end, a body in a cart surrounded by fish. The fact of his death a secret because the people traveling with him were already calculating. Li Si and Zhao Gao knew he was dead. They chose not to announce it. Their reasons were not identical. Li Si's calculation was, in part, about the succession and the stability of the transition. A concern about what would happen to the empire if news of the emperor's death spread before a successor was established and secured. This was not an entirely irrational concern. Zhao Gao's calculation was about power, pure and simple. The emperor had a designated heir, or, at least, an obvious candidate. Fusu, the eldest son, who had been sent to the northern frontier in political exile for objecting too publicly to his father's harshest measures. Fusu was capable, relatively popular, and backed by General Meng Tian, who commanded the largest army in the empire. This combination, a capable successor with military backing, was not in Zhao Gao's interest. A capable emperor with a powerful general as his ally had no need for Zhao Gao. A weak emperor, on the other hand, would need someone to manage things, would need a trusted intermediary, would need Zhao Gao. He persuaded Li Si. Together they forged imperial documents in the dead emperor's name. The documents ordered Fusu and Meng Tian to commit suicide. The reasons given were fabricated. Accusations of military failure, of dishonoring the empire. But they came with the imperial seal. They came with the authority of the emperor's name. And, in a system built on the absolute authority of the emperor's word, that was enough. Fusu received the order and obeyed it. He did not investigate, did not question, did not attempt to verify. He was, by the accounts that survive him, a person of genuine moral seriousness, someone who believed in doing the right thing as he understood it. And the right thing, in the system his father had built, was to comply with the emperor's commands without resistance. He killed himself in obedience to a command that was a lie. Meng Tian resisted longer. He was suspicious. The order had reached him in circumstances that felt wrong, and he was a general accustomed to thinking about conditions that didn't add up. He initially refused to comply and sent a message requesting clarification. The clarification, predictably, confirmed the order. He complied. Hu Hai, the younger son who Zhao Gao had maneuvered into position, became the second emperor of Qin. He was young, inexperienced, and entirely dependent on Zhao Gao for his understanding of what was happening in his empire. What was happening was collapse. The speed of the collapse is still striking to historians who study it. The Qin dynasty, the entity that had unified China for the first time, that had built roads and walls and standardized currencies and scripts and weights, that had deployed an army of 300,000 on the northern frontier, was gone within 4 years of the first emperor's death. The first major rebellion broke out in 209 BCE, barely a year after his death. It began in a way that captures something essential about the system that produced it. 2 men, Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, had been assigned to lead a group of soldiers to a garrison posting in the north. They were delayed by rain. Under Qin law, arriving late to a posting carried the same punishment as desertion: death. They were going to die for being rained on. The absurdity of this, the mechanical application of a legal code that made no distinction between failure and weather, captures the brittleness of the system. A legal framework this rigid, applied this consistently to people who had done nothing wrong in any meaningful sense, generates a particular kind of resentment. Not the resentment of people who have broken rules and been caught. The resentment of people who have followed the rules and been destroyed anyway. Chen Sheng made a decision that would seem, in the moment, like desperation. If death was certain either way, at least die fighting. He raised the banner of rebellion, and the response revealed how much pressure had been building, unseen in the provinces that the emperor's reports had described as stable. People joined, hundreds of them, then thousands. The rebellion spread. Other uprisings ignited independently. Former noble families who had been displaced and watched and resented their displacement for 15 years found the moment to act. Local officials who had been filing optimistic reports about stable conditions while watching those conditions deteriorate suddenly found that the force capable of punishing their inaccuracy no longer existed. The Qin dynasty's response was disorganized. The second emperor, receiving filtered reports through Zhao Gao, initially did not fully grasp what was happening. By the time the scale of the crisis was undeniable, the court had lost cohesion. Li Si, the man who had helped build the empire, who had contributed as much as any individual other than the emperor himself to its design, was accused by Zhao Gao of disloyalty, tried under the empire's own legal system, and executed in 208 BCE. His death removed the last major figure with the competence and experience to manage the crisis. Zhao Gao eventually had the second emperor killed and tried to install yet another puppet, a grandson of the first emperor named Ziying. Ziying, correctly assessing the situation, had Zhao Gao killed before Zhao Gao could maneuver further. But it was too late for any of this to matter. The empire was already lost. Ziying surrendered to Liu Bang, a man of genuinely common origins who had risen through the rebellion to command one of the major rebel forces, in 206 BCE. The Qin dynasty was over. Liu Bang would go on to found the Han dynasty, which would rule China for over 400 years and provide the stable successor framework that the Qin's 15-year reign had failed to achieve. The lesson that observers drew from the collapse was immediate and widely articulated. Qin had governed by fear and force alone, without the moral legitimacy that the Confucian tradition associated with the proper governance. It had taken from the people, in labor, in taxes, in sons, far more than it had given. And when the taking machine broke down, there was nothing left. No loyalty to call on, no belief in the system worth defending. Just people who had been compelled, and who stopped complying the moment the compulsion stopped. Control can enforce order. It cannot manufacture loyalty. And when the order fails, all you have is what people actually believe in. The Han dynasty that replaced Qin is where the conventional story tends to end the Qin chapter. The bad dynasty falls. The good dynasty rises. The lesson about virtue being more durable than force is absorbed, and history moves on. But this ending is incomplete, because the Han dynasty did not undo what Qin had built. It kept it, modified it, humanized it in certain dimensions, wrapped it in a different ideological framework, but kept the fundamental structure. The commandery county administrative system remained. The empire continued to be governed by centrally appointed officials rather than by local lords with hereditary claims. The unified currency remained. The standardized weights and measures remained. The roads remained. The infrastructure of imperial unity that Qin had constructed became the infrastructure that Han inherited and used and maintained and extended. Most durably of all, the written script remained. Li Si's standardized small seal script evolved into the clerical script of the Han period, and eventually into the classical Chinese characters that served as the literary and administrative language of East Asia for over 2,000 years. Not just China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam all, at various points in their histories, used variants of the Chinese character system for official and literary purposes. The reach of this standardization is almost impossible to overstate. Consider what it meant that people across an empire of several hundred million could read the same written language despite speaking mutually incomprehensible dialects. That a document written in the capital could be read in the southernmost provinces. That classical texts from the Han period could be read by scholars in the Tang dynasty 600 years later. That the examination system which governed access to imperial officialdom for over 1,000 years was conducted in a written form that was essentially continuous with what Qin Shi Huang had standardized. All of this traces back, at least in part, to that original act of linguistic unification. Then there is the question of what China is, as a concept, as an expectation, as a default assumption about how this territory and these people relate to each other. The Zhou dynasty before Qin had exercised a kind of nominal suzerainty over a collection of effectively autonomous states, maintaining the idea of cultural and cosmological unity while the reality was fragmentation. The Warring States period had been the reality of fragmentation without even the pretense of unity. Qin Shi Huang created the actual thing, demonstrated, by doing it, that this territory could be administered as a single political entity. That demonstration was irreversible in a particular way. Once something has been shown to be possible, it becomes the standard against which other arrangements are measured. The centuries after Qin saw periods of division, some of them long and deeply destructive. But those periods were perceived by the people living through them as deviations from a norm rather than as the natural state of affairs. The norm was unity. Qin had created the norm. Every subsequent dynasty that unified China was, in a sense, completing a project that Qin had defined. The Han, the Tang, the Song, the Ming, the Qing. They all justified their authority, partly through their ability to maintain the unified territory that had become the standard. The Emperor Taizong of Tang, ruling 8 centuries after the first emperor, was operating within a framework of imperial legitimacy that the first emperor had invented. This is a form of legacy that is almost impossible to measure. It is not the legacy of a specific institution or policy; those can be traced. It is the legacy of an organizing idea, that China is one thing, that its unity is its natural condition, that a division is a problem to be solved. This idea, once established, became self-reinforcing. People organized their political aspirations around it. Rulers justified their violence in its name. Scholars debated the proper form of its expression, but rarely questioned its validity. He did not create this idea from nothing. The Zhou dynasty's ideology of cosmic unity, the mandate of heaven, the emperor as the link between heaven and the human world, provided the intellectual raw material. But he made it real in a way it had not been real before. He turned an aspiration into a demonstrated fact. And then there is the tomb. It remains largely unexcavated under Mount Li. The terracotta warriors, the portion that has been excavated, draw millions of visitors every year and are among the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The main burial chamber has been located but not opened. The decision to wait, to develop better preservation technology before attempting to excavate, means that whatever lies inside is still there, still sealed, still unknown in its particulars. In a strange way, this serves his intentions. He wanted to persist. He built toward permanence with every resource available to him. His body is gone. What exactly happened to it in the intervening 2,000 years is unknown. But the space he built for himself, the army he built to guard it, the system of traps he built to protect it, these persist. He is, in a limited but real sense, still there, still surrounded by the things he made. Still, in that small corner of the world, in control. He was not a hero. The people who worked in his labor gangs were not heroes in his story. They were resources. The scholars who were executed were not obstacles to be overcome. They were people with ideas that threatened a power they had not consented to. The families who sent sons north and waited in vain were not background characters in an imperial epic. They were the cost of the epic, paid in currencies of grief that no administrative system can account for. He was not simply a villain either. Villain is a category that implies a different path not taken, an evil chosen when good was available. The world he was operating in was not offering clean choices. The Warring States period was not sustainable. The question was not whether to change it, but how and at what cost, and who would bear that cost. He made choices about those questions that led to outcomes that were, simultaneously, remarkable achievements and terrible human costs. The achievements are real. The costs are real. Insisting on only one side of this, making him the monster to feel morally situated, or making him the visionary to feel historically sophisticated, is a way of not quite engaging with the full weight of what he did and what it meant. The full weight is this: one man, working within a particular historical moment with particular resources and particular capacities, reshaped the fundamental conditions of a civilization. The shape he imposed lasted. The people who came, after lived within it, were formed by it, built on it, resisted parts of it and accepted other parts, and are still, in ways both visible and invisible, inside the world he made. That is not a common thing. That is barely a describable thing. It is the closest thing that history has to a definition of consequence. What do we do with this? The story of Qin Shi Huang resists the resolutions we usually want from history. We want heroes and villains because heroes and villains are comprehensible. They come with built-in moral orientation. Admire this, condemn that, and you know where you stand. The story of the first emperor keeps refusing to offer that. Every time the condemnation seems complete, the book burning, the forced labor, the executions, something appears that complicates it. The end of centuries of war, the foundation of a civilization that would endure, the demonstration that this vast and diverse territory could be held and administered as one. And every time the admiration seems settled, the brilliance of the standardization, the scale of what was built, the fact that the Han and Tang and Song were all building on his foundation. Something complicates that too. The people who paid for it. The cost that was extracted, without consent and without mercy, from the millions of people who didn't get to have a view on whether unified China was worth their suffering. The tension between order and freedom is not new. It predates Qin Shi Huang. It will outlast every attempt to resolve it. But he enacted it at a scale and with a clarity that makes it impossible to look away. He ended chaos, real chaos, the kind that kills, the kind that spreads across generations like a disease, that takes fathers and sons and grandsons into armies and fields of blood, and leaves families to reconstruct themselves from whoever comes back. For the people who had lived through the Warring States period, who had survived it, who remembered it, who carried it in their bodies as a permanent condition of alertness and fear, the end of that chaos was not nothing. It was not an abstraction. It was real relief, real safety, real possibility. But the order that replaced the chaos was not neutral. It was the emperor's order, built on the emperor's terms, enforced by the emperor's instruments. The safety it provided was real. The cost it extracted was also real. And the people who paid the cost, the conscripted workers, the burned books scholars, the displaced noble families, the communities drained of their young men, did not choose to pay it. It was taken from them. This is the structure of the bargain that Qin Shi Huang offered, and that his successors, not just Chinese emperors but rulers of large-scale political entities across history, have offered in various forms: order in exchange for submission, safety in exchange for compliance, the elimination of one form of suffering, the suffering of chaos, in exchange for a different form of suffering, the suffering of coercion. The question of whether the bargain is worth it does not have a universal answer. It depends on the chaos being replaced, the severity of the coercion, the distribution of costs and benefits, the availability of alternatives. For the farmer who no longer had to watch, his field burn, yes. For the scholar buried alive for defending a philosophical tradition, obviously not. The same bargain, different answers, different people. What Qin Shi Huang could not offer, what he did not offer, what perhaps he was incapable of thinking in terms of, was the version of order that doesn't require continuous coercion. The version where people maintain the system because they believe in it, because it serves them in ways that are visible and real, because their connection to it is something other than fear of what happens if they stop complying. The Han dynasty understood, at least partially, that this was the missing element. Han emperors reduced taxes, rebuilt the scholar class, reintegrated Confucian legitimizing ideology into the framework of imperial authority. They kept the structures of Qin, the administrative apparatus, the roads, the unified script, but tried to give them a different moral basis, not just force, something that asked for belief, even if imperfectly. It was more durable. The Han lasted 400 years. Qin lasted 15. The lesson seems clear, stated that way. But it's worth sitting with the fact that the thing the Han preserved, and that every dynasty after preserved, was built by the emperor who ruled for 15 years and collapsed. The infrastructure of Chinese civilization, the network through which everything else traveled, was his. The more durable dynasties were durable partly because they had something to build on. He built the foundation. He could not build what the foundation was supposed to support. He ended chaos. But in doing so, he created something else. A new set of questions about what power is for, whether order imposed from above can ever become order lived from within, whether unity, once created, carries with it obligations to the people who are united, obligations that cannot be perpetually deferred without cost. These questions are not historical relics. They are not settled. They appear in different forms in every large-scale political arrangement that exists today. The tension between centralized authority and local autonomy, between unity and difference, between efficiency and freedom. These are his inheritance to everyone who came after him, not just in China, but in the way that Chinese history shaped the wider world. He wanted to be the first emperor. He wanted there to be a second and a third and a thousandth. He wanted the number to go on until it lost meaning. The dynasty lasted 15 years, but the argument about what order costs and who pays and whether it's worth it, and what obligations power creates and what price unity demands, that argument has lasted 2,000 years. It is still being made, in different languages, in different contexts, with different specifics, but in the shape of the question, in the structure of the problem, in the recognition that controlling territory is the beginning of governance and not its end. He is still there, still present, still, in some sense, waiting to see how it resolves. It hasn't resolved yet.